During the Second World War, young men from every corner of the globe enlisted in their nation's armed forces to defend their homeland. Unlike the First World War, there were no parades or songs of valor and triumph as the men shipped out. Only mothers and fathers watching their boys step off the docks to an unknown fate. Many families across the United States had multiple sons enlist in the armed forces at the outbreak of war. In Steven Spielberg's fictional 1998 film Saving Private Ryan, they tell the story of 4 brothers fighting in World War II. 3 of the brothers are killed in action, and a unit is sent to track down and return home the 4th brother. Unlike Spielberg's fictional film, 4 brothers from Gardiner, New York served in the United States Armed Forces during the war. The Jayne family had 2 sons fighting in the South Pacific, and 1 fighting his way across Europe. Each of them had different reasons for serving, but the war would impact them all. Humble beginnings. Living in Gardiner, New York, 80 miles north of New York City, the Jayne family lived a middle-class life with their 8 children. Their father was a tinker around town working with tin. He also sold cast-iron stoves and worked for a time as a plumber and a roofer. Like many Americans living in the 1930s, the Great Depression greatly affected the family. There are stories of the family being forced to sell much of the furniture in their house to have enough money to eat. This humble upbringing was reflected later in life with the men not wanting anything to go to waste. The oldest brother, George William Jayne, was born January 20th, 1912. George worked in the hospitality industry at the Lake Montauk Hotel on the Shawangunk Ridge in Ulster County, New York. During the 1930s, George worked on cruise ships in Florida, and at one time for a wealthy man that would go to Cuba to gamble. He would take George with him to be his driver. George was married and had 2 children. Louis Marcus Jayne Jr. was born February 26, 1915. During the 1930s, Louis served in the United States Marine Corps, but was discharged after being reported as AWOL on New Year's Eve. It's rare for a Marine to be discharged over what appears to be a minor infraction, but no additional records could be found on the incident. He went to New Paltz State College for 3 years and left in 1940. Louis worked in construction as part of a blasting crew in mines and tunnels in Rosclair, Illinois. Edwin Seward Jayne was born February 29, 1920. Edwin left school in the 8th grade to help support the family during the Depression. Edwin joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, a program created by President Roosevelt to put young Americans to work. Edwin was sent to the Rocky Mountains as part of a road crew laying asphalt in the mountain ranges. Francis Marvin Jayne, known as Frank, was born February 15, 1925. Frank was the last son in the house, since his brothers were away working. Growing up in the 1930s, it was a very hard time for the family, and for Frank. He graduated from high school in 1943. Brothers at War. After the December 7th attack at Pearl Harbor, Edwin felt motivated to enlist and serve his country. Like many Americans, he felt the need to enlist to protect his nation, and he spoke of feeling a sense of honor and duty. On February 13, 1942, Edwin enlisted in the Navy. He served aboard the USS Lardner, DD 487, which was commissioned on May 13, 1942. The Lardner was a 348-foot Glebes-class destroyer with a crew of 276 men. On August 21, 1942, the USS Lardner exited the Panama Canal en route to the South Pacific. Shortly after arriving in the Pacific, Lardner was assigned to Task Force 18 to screen ships. On September 15, 1942, while steaming from Santa Cruz Islands to Espiritu Santo, Task Force 18 came under fire. The USS Wasp was torpedoed and sank, leaving her sailors struggling in the ocean water. The Lardner deployed depth charges and rescued 322 survivors from the Wasp. After rescuing the crew of the USS Wasp, Lardner was sent to aid in the decisive Battle of Guadalcanal. Lardner screened warships transporting Marines to the island. On November 30th, Lardner, while assigned to Task Force 7, took part in the Battle of Tassafarna. In a 2-year period aboard the Lardner, Edwin took part in several decisive battles in the Pacific, seeing an extensive amount of combat. The USS Lardner received 10 battle stars for service during World War II. In 1944, the Lardner returned to the United States, and Edwin went on leave. After a short time away, he was recalled and put aboard the USS Brush to return to battle. The USS Brush, DD-745, was a 376-foot Allen M. Summer-class destroyer with a crew of 336 men. The Brush sailed with the 3rd and 5th Fleet, taking part in operations in Leyte, the invasion of Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. These small islands saw some of the worst fighting in history, with the battles on the ocean raging just as fierce. The Brush provided support to Allied warships operating in the campaign, as well as providing gun support to troops on the ground. It's important to mention that sailors are in danger not only from the enemy, but from the ocean itself. In December 1944, Edwin and the Brush were caught in Typhoon Cobra. The winds reached hurricane-force levels, with waves peaking at 30 to 40 feet high. 3 American destroyers sank in the typhoon, with 775 sailors being lost. The 3rd Fleet had 27 ships damaged to the point they needed to return to the harbor for repairs. In late 1945, Edwin was discharged from the Navy and returned home. Lewis was drafted into the United States Army and began active service on August 14, 1943. Lewis was a tank driver assigned to Company A, 701st Tank Battalion. The 701st landed in France in August 1944 and began their push to Berlin. Lewis drove an American Sherman tank. The Sherman was a medium tank, with the thickest armor being only 3 inches thick. The Sherman was cheap to manufacture and cheap to transport en masse. While their reliability and low costs made the American High Command fall in love with the tank crews, on the other hand, found them to be a metal death trap. The 88mm gun of the German Tiger and the 75mm gun of the Panther would cut through the Sherman armor with ease. In late 1944 through early 1945, the 701st supported ground troops in the Battle of the Bulge and the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. In February 1945, the 701st had crossed the Roer River and saw its heaviest combat in the town of Tetz, Hattorf, Verzen, and Krefeld. As Allied troops pushed deeper into Nazi Germany, the defenders became more determined to repel them. On March 29, 1945, the 701st crossed the Rhine, fighting through Munster, Boone, and Bismarck. Lewis and his tank arrived in Gardiner, Germany, where they witnessed the true horror of the Nazi war machine. As Allied troops drew near, SS commanders attempted to empty their prisons and move prisoners to the interior of Germany. Some 4,000 prisoners from Dora Mittelbau, its satellite camps, and a Neuengamme subcamp arrived in Gardiner, where they were forced to dismount from the rail cars due to damage from Allied air raids. SS guards recruited auxiliary forces from the local fire department, the Air Force, the Aged Home Guard, and the Hitler Youth to watch over the inmates. On April 13th, more than 1,000 prisoners, many of whom were too weak to march on, were taken from the town center to the outskirts of Gardiner, where they were locked in a barn. The barn was set ablaze with gasoline, and all the prisoners inside were killed. Lewis and the 701st Tank Battalion arrived in Gardiner to discover the horrific sight. The American troops forced the men of Gardiner to dig individual graves for the murdered prisoners. American Colonel George Lynch spoke to the citizens of Gardiner, saying, quote, "The German people have been told the stories of German atrocities were Allied propaganda. Here, you can see for yourself. Some will say that the Nazis were responsible for this crime. Others will point to the Gestapo. The responsibility rests with neither. It is the responsibility of the German people. Your so-called master race has demonstrated that it is the master only of crime, cruelty, and sadism. You have lost the respect of the civilized world." The 701st got as close as 50 miles from Berlin, halting on the Elbe River. Lewis and his Sherman tank fought through multiple countries, taking part in some of the harshest fighting of the European theater. Lewis returned home receiving the EAME Service Medal, American Service Medal, Good Conduct Medal, and World War II Victory Medal. George was drafted into the United States Navy in late 1943. He was assigned to the USS Ticonderoga. The Ticonderoga was an Essex-class aircraft carrier, measuring 889 feet in length, with a crew of 3,448 men. In November 1944, the Ticonderoga was sailing with Task Force 38, supporting the campaign in Luzon and Leyte. Ticonderoga's aircraft wreaked havoc on the Japanese, sinking the light cruiser Kiso, heavy cruiser Nashi, and 56 other ships. Her aircraft shot down an estimated 93 Japanese aircraft during her time at sea. George and the USS Ticonderoga experienced the full wrath of the Japanese defense of their homeland. In the closing stages of the war, American sailors realized just how determined the Japanese soldier was to defend their island. Japanese pilots would point their planes to the sea and attempt to fly directly into an American ship. These kamikaze, or divine wind attacks, turned out to be deadly and destructive. During her time in the Pacific, the USS Ticonderoga had successfully fought off 2 separate kamikaze attacks. But in the morning hours of January 21st, 1945, the Japanese pilots would strike with deadly accuracy. A Japanese plane smashed into Ticonderoga's flight deck by the No. 2 28mm anti-aircraft gun. The crew began damage control by flooding the magazines to prevent further explosions. While the crew was changing course to counteract the list in the ship, a second Japanese plane struck Ticonderoga. The second plane struck the island, causing immense damage to the bridge, leaving the captain of the ship mortally wounded and killing another 100 sailors. George was wounded during the kamikaze attack, with a piece of metal piercing his hand. George and the rest of the crew fought to bring the blaze under control and to keep the mighty warship afloat. Ticonderoga limped into Ulithi for repairs before returning to Puget Sound Navy Yard in February for more permanent repairs. George was discharged from the Navy, but the Ticonderoga continued the war effort after repairs. After graduating from high school, Frank enlisted in the United States Navy. He was selected to be a part of the Navy's V-12 program, which sent young men to college. As the war raged on, the Navy feared losing junior officers to fill its ranks, so the V-12 program was created. 125,000 men took part in the program across 131 colleges and universities. Candidates attended standard college courses, as well as required naval courses, such as seamanship, navigation, ordnance, and how to act like an officer. Following their graduation, the candidates would be enlisted as an ensign in the Navy. Returning home. Following World War II, the birth rate in the United States reached unprecedented levels. Between 1946 and 1964, 4.25 million new babies were added to the population each year. The greatest generation, as they came to be known, settled down, found jobs, and started families. The Jayne brothers were no different. Edwin married and briefly attended aircraft mechanics school on Long Island on the GI Bill before beginning work at General Electric in Schenectady, New York. After leaving General Electric, he began working at IBM. He settled in Highland, New York, a small town on the Hudson River north of New York City. He raised 6 children in New York before settling in Raleigh, North Carolina to retire. Edwin passed away in 1998 and is buried in his hometown of Gardiner, New York. George settled in New Paltz, New York, and successfully owned and operated a college bar and restaurant in town. The bar is still open today. He also worked as a building inspector for the town. George married and raised 2 children before retiring to Port St. Lucie, Florida. He passed away in 1995 and is buried in Stuart, Florida. After the war, Lewis married and raised 1 son in Burnt Hills, New York. Lewis lived a quiet life working for General Electric until his death in 1993. Frank married and raised 2 children in Southern California, working as a highway planner and design engineer for the California Department of Transportation until his death in 1997. In discussing the lives of these 4 men with relatives that knew them, they share a similar sentiment towards their fathers and uncles. They do not want their service and sacrifice to be something more than it was. The humility with which they served would be offended by boasting or sensationalizing what they did for their country. Alone, these 4 men were powerless to stop Nazi aggression in Europe and Japanese expansion in the Pacific. But collectively, as strong and free Americans, along with thousands of brothers, they changed the world. Never seeking individual recognition or accolades, they returned home and carried on their lives building families, careers, and communities that endure today. Edwin's youngest son says about his father, quote, "I guess my dad did his part. He answered the call and never asked much in return. The opposite is actually true. Until the end of his life, he continued to serve his community and instill a sense of service and duty in all of his 6 children. A quiet man with a noteworthy life."